Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Samanth Subramanian, who is a journalist and writer and the author of the recent books The Web Beneath the Waves and A Dominant Character, The Radical Science and Restless Politics of JBS Haldane. We talked about underwater sea cables and the choke points in critical global infrastructure, the intersection of technology and geopolitics, large language models, JBS Haldane and the relationship between science and politics, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi, Samanth. Welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much, Shruti. Pleasure to see you, as always.
I know it's been years. I think the last time we sat in person and chatted was pre-COVID in New York City.
I think that's right. I was living there 2018, 2019 on a fellowship, and we hung out then. And then, of course, I moved out. I moved to England, which is where I still live.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen each other since.
Yeah, and I moved out. I live in Washington, D.C. And I don't know, it just feels right to do this conversation online where you are, in UK and I'm on the East Coast, because what I really want to discuss with you is your most recent book, which is The Web Beneath the Waves. I've got a copy right here. And this is about the underwater sea cables that actually make most of our internet communication and data transfers possible. So I feel like this conversation, we should probably be having this online. It just seems fitting.
Yeah, it's very meta. It may be meta in more ways than one. This conversation may be flowing back and forth on a cable owned by Meta as well. So it's like meta in multiple ways.
Yeah, when I was reading somewhere about the W that Meta is going to draw through, or rather lay the cables through a W.
Yeah.
It reminded me of those Gold Rush movies. The gold is under the W. So if we want to go into like crazy movie zone, we can also do that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But let me start with the book. So the book's main argument is that the way we normally think about the internet is it is sort of somewhere in the air or the cloud, right? It's not something that is material other than literally the phone we hold in our hands or, the iPad where we're watching stuff. But largely it feels digital, not physical to us. But there is an entire physical infrastructure that obviously holds this system together. And in this particular book, you point out that this physical infrastructure that we take so much for granted and is, largely invisible can be quite vulnerable. And you do this in a few different ways. You talk about places like Tonga, where there was a volcanic eruption, places like Taiwan. Of course, these two are islands, but this could also happen in other places that are not islands. And then, you walk into details of geopolitics, corporate power and so on. And normally I would just launch into all the questions I have coming out of the book, but I have a feeling no one knows what this underwater network or undersea network is. So if you can give the listeners like a primer on exactly what you're talking about, then we can dive into the rest of the questions.
Wow. Okay. Well, a primer would involve me saying that 95% of all data traffic that flows internationally goes through underwater internet cables. This is data traffic of every conceivable kind. It includes most obviously emails and Zoom calls and, cloud software presentations and day trades and everything, all the kinds of data that you can think of. It additionally also carries data you probably didn't think travels through these cables. So right now, for example, you and I, Shruti, are from a generation where we thought of the landline as distinct from the cell phone or from the internet. But there is no such landline cable that's completely different now. All the calls are digitized and sent back through these fiber optic cables. So there's, between 500 and 550 of these cables around the world. Together, add up their lengths, and it's like close to 1 million miles of cable that has been laid. And this is only fiber optic cable that I'm talking about. This is only the kind of technology that has been around for about 50 years in commercial use. It doesn't include miles and miles and miles of cable that have been laid since the dawn of the telegraph age in the 1850s. So, so when you think about it, the materiality of the internet that we talked about earlier, that you brought up, is largely concentrated in these cables. Of course, there's also data centers and there's landing stations and there's all these other things. But I think those are to some extent above land and therefore visible. I think what makes these cables doubly invisible, one is, of course, that they're tucked away out of sight under the ocean. But then secondly, also they disappear from the very language that we use to describe the internet. It's astonishing how big a role language and lexicon play in forming our conception of something. So when we use on a daily basis terms like Wi-Fi, wireless, mobile, cell phones,
Cloud.
cloud, we've kind of abstracted away the materiality of it. And push comes to shove, if you really ask the man on the street sort of what was carrying his data signals around, he would probably say the satellites that are orbiting the Earth. But the truth is, satellites carry a tiny, tiny fraction of that data. They would never be able to cope with the voracious volume of data that we consume on a daily basis.
Yeah. So, you talked about materiality of the wired network, which is also something Nicole, I think I'm going to butcher her last name, Staroselsky, is that about
No,
right?
Starozielski, yeah.
Starozielsky.
Yeah.
Okay, she talks about this, but the layer that I found added in your work is you get straight to the point of vulnerability and resilience, and the most direct example of that is the one that you begin with, which is the island of Tonga, which is, I guess, the closest large landmass is New Zealand from there,
Yeah.
and it's in one of the Pacific Islands. They have this enormous volcanic eruption which damages the two cables that actually connect them to the islands to each other and also to the rest of the world.
Right.
And then everything else that follows. And when I was reading that part, it was again, it was very jarring for me because you and I come from that generation where, the dial up wouldn't connect. And we used to think about wireless systems and Wi-Fi systems and these digital systems as something you can't really rely on. What you can rely on is physical systems, right? There is a landline, there is a corded phone.
Yeah.
I remember when the cordless phone first came, it would just die. The battery would just die. So past a point, you started relying more on the rotary dial-up phones. And now it's kind of flipped, right? You're talking about how it is the material stuff which is underwater, and you describe in great detail how those optic wires are actually quite thin, given the task that they've been mandated for. And everything else, which is sort of invisible, seems to be a resilient network, but the material is what is eventually going to fail us. Is that a good way to think about it? Or am I just anachronistic and come from a generation where materials didn't fail?
That's really interesting. I haven't thought about it in this way. I mean, the truth is that there are roughly 100 cable cuts, cable breaks that happen around the world every year. The Tonga case is an extreme version, and I kind of picked it because I really wanted to see, well, what happens to a society, to an economy, to a country when it is completely subtracted from the internet for a long period of time? Like, how do you deal with that? And what are the unexpected ways in which a country or a society will struggle? But the truth is, as I said, there's 100 cuts that happen in cables every year. For the most part, we don't feel it because there's been quite a lot of redundancy that's been built into these cable systems. You live on the east coast of the US, I live in London. These are two of the most heavily wired places on the planet. If three cables were to go down, transatlantic cables, we would barely feel it because it would just be that burden would be taken up by other systems. Where it is felt, I think, is on the fringes or the periphery of, in Tonga's case, sort of the map itself as we usually conceive of it. So Tonga is sort of to the bottom right, as you said, near New Zealand, but then also the fringes of the world economy. I mean, if you're not as important to the world economy, you're not cabled as densely, and if you're not cabled as densely, then the loss of one cable can really make a difference. So I think materiality serves us quite well for the most part. But of course, what is important to remember is that materials can fail, and materials can be targeted, and materials can be superseded, or and we're talking about materials that are out of sight, dozens of miles below the ocean, and so those are mysterious realms in and of themselves. So it's very hard to kind of predict on a day to day or year to year basis, the challenges that will come up. And yet the industry does a surprisingly good job of, keeping track of that and making sure that there isn't sort of some kind of worldwide outage of internet cables. And we can get to how they do that, but I think that's interesting in and of itself.
Actually, that would be super helpful to get into how they do that. And the sort of network of there are people who manufacture these cables, there are these cable laying companies, the
Right.
ships that lay the cables do it in not exactly the same way, but it's kind of reminiscent of how the telegraph cables were laid.
Yeah.
And then of course the people who repair it, that's an entire infrastructure. And now the new big tech that is getting involved in both financing and laying the cables. So it'll be good to maybe you can talk about this because you'll know a lot more, and then I'll have a bunch of follow-up questions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe it would help describe sort of how this industry has evolved over the last like 30 years. So in the 90s, well, in the early 90s, any cables that were being laid were laid with the collaboration of state-owned telecom companies. I mean, all around the world, there would be a state-owned company, and it would sort of say, "Well, look, we need a cable to go from the UK to Singapore, stopping off in Portugal and South Africa, and somewhere in the Middle East and India, and then Singapore." So all these state-owned companies would come together. They would kick in investment. They would divide bandwidth as was necessary, and that was the model. Around 1999, the late 90s, let's say, it slowly started to become a norm that a private investor would come and would kind of raise investment either through themselves or through a bunch of other investors and would arrange for this cable to be laid and then go to these state owned companies and say, look, the only reason I need you now really is to buy bandwidth from me and to get the requisite government permits that are needed to land these cables on their shores. So the investors started doing it this way. This way, there was like these consortiums started to come together, consortiums of investors, and they would lay these cables and they would own them. And of course, they would subcontract out everything else. So you buy the cable from a cable manufacturer, you hire a cable laying company to lay these cables, and then that company would be responsible for mapping the seafloor, conducting sort of safety evaluations, figuring out the best and most efficient route, and then actually laying the cable. And of course, if the cable were to break, that same company would go out there and raise it to the surface, repair it on the ship, which still happens, and drop it back down. That was sort of the model for a long time until very recently, in fact. And I think that started to change about between 7 and 10 years ago, when some of these big tech companies, and I'm talking about primarily Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft, these companies that live and thrive on data. I mean, that data is their lifeblood, and they were already kind of building data centers. Some of them had written their own operating systems for their data centers. I mean, they really sort of data is everything to them, and so I think they started figuring out that the expense of a cable, while considerable to you and me, is not as considerable to them. These are very cash-rich businesses. So it costs about $500 million right now, give or take, to lay a cable across the Atlantic. But to a company like Google, which depends on cables and sort of data continuity, as they would call it, it makes perfect sense to say, I will lay the cable, I will own most of it, I will sell bandwidth to other people. And so they started getting into this game to the point that when I wrote this book, 2 out of every 3 new cables were being laid by one of these 4 tech companies. And I think that is sort of the state of play right now, still, by and large. There's a huge new acceleration of interest in cables because of the AI revolution, because you need to build more data centers, data has to be funneled through these data centers.
The latency has to be even, cut down further.
It does, but also you can just think of it as it's sort of a use case for
Yeah.
data. I hate these
Yeah.
terms. A use case for data that didn't exist 4 years ago,
Yeah.
but now suddenly exists and it's just layered onto everything else that we're doing. It's not like
Yeah.
we've stopped using data elsewhere. We just continue to stream Netflix, but also send ChatGPT questions about what I'm watching on Netflix.
Yeah.
So you need more cabling and more data infrastructure to cope with all of that. And so I think you will only see more concentration among these 4 tech giants of ownership of bandwidth, essentially, of ownership of the bandwidth at the bottom of the sea.
So, I was thinking about two ways the world could go because of this new kind of corporate concentration. So, as an economist, I think that it just makes sense, right? The people who profit the most from a particular infrastructure should be the ones who also contribute to that infrastructure, because otherwise, to a very large extent, a lot of them kind of free ride on infrastructure that was built in a decentralized way by lots of people over a long period of time. So, to me, the fact that they actually finance or pay for this doesn't bother me on its own. It's more a question of, what happens when it comes to resilience. But on the other hand, I also feel like this might make the system more resilient because all these companies are American companies. And now I have a feeling most countries will start thinking about American companies controlling so much of the sort of, underwater sea cable data system that they need to start bringing in some other backup plan or resilience in case, they either deny these companies entry into their own territories or markets, or, they're in a trade war with the United States, which at this point, frankly, I think most countries are. I don't
Yeah,
know how it'll be by the time the episode releases. It keeps changing.
yeah.
But which way do you see this going? Because I can see this going either way, that this could end up with more concentration and the system becoming overall more concentrated and less resilient, or it could also spur a lot of people into thinking about, hey, we really need to figure this out now. We can't let these four companies control it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at an interesting inflection point right now. I mean, I think like a lot of people are clearly realizing that this kind of concentration is not a good idea. I mean, in the industry, if you go and talk about it to them, everybody's worried about it. They're worried not only about the concentration on the American side, but they're worried about America's insistence that Chinese companies should have no role to play in a lot of this infrastructure. And that's just not feasible. I mean, this is just not, I mean, if you want a global internet that connects China as well as many other countries, which we all do, you can't just say Chinese companies can't have any role in financing, laying, repairing these
So
cables.
you're hinting to like the Huawei kind of situation where any company which was buying their equipment couldn't
Yeah,
lay
yeah.
cables for the United States, stuff like that, right?
Very, very, very specifically that, because there was a
Yeah,
spin-off
okay.
company from Huawei called HMN, Huawei Marine Networks, and they were for a long time sort of building up their own capacity to lay cables. So at some point, if, for example, let me say, a European telecom company decided that it wanted a short cable laid, they could go to Subcom, which is an American company, or they could go to ASN, which is a French company, but they could also go to HMN. And HMN might give them a better quote, and so that would be competitive. Now, what happens is if there are cable systems in which any American company is involved at all, the US government prohibits the Chinese involvement in that same cable system. It doesn't even have to be a cable system that touches America.
Yeah.
There are at least two cable systems I know that have been sort of stopped in their tracks because the US government sort of laid down this law and things had already been committed. In one case, the cables had been laid, but you just can't switch them on because there was Chinese involvement in it, and the U.S. government decided sometime in 2018 or 2019 that that would not work. So what worries people is what they see as some kind of like bifurcation of the internet.
Yeah.
And these are terms that people use in the industry. So this is not sort of my gloom and
Yeah.
doomism, but it's their terms. It's interesting that you say that maybe, larger geopolitical developments might make governments think twice about allowing American cable systems onto their soil, about pushing back against this American concentration. One would think that that would be the natural state of affairs. I haven't seen it play out yet, but these are slow moving developments. Cables are expensive to build.
Yeah.
There are, there's not many companies that lay these cables.
Yeah.
There's only four or five big ones, and one of the biggest is Subcom, which is an American company, which not only contracts to Google, but also contracts to the American DoD.
Yeah.
Again, Subcom is able to sort of exert a certain amount of American influence on the laying of cables elsewhere. So I haven't seen this happen yet, but this would, again, as you say, this would be a natural reaction for a lot of companies to decide, a lot of countries to decide that, well, maybe this is the way that they will find their own kind of resilience that is independent of American networks.
Yeah, the reason it occurred to me was, recently I was talking to Pranay Kothastane about rare earths and critical minerals. And like, for the most part, no one paid attention to rare earths and critical minerals, right? They're a
Yeah,
tiny, tiny part of the electronics or the batteries that we build out.
yeah,
And then suddenly, when China says it's going to put in export controls, is when everyone wakes up to the fact that it's this tiny thing, but we all need it desperately. And now every country has a mandate for stockpiling it, or they've started forming, stockpile consortia.
yeah.
And or India has its own rare earths and critical minerals mission and things like that. So I'm wondering if we just haven't had this crazy world event yet which will spur us in that direction, because sometimes it takes that one thing. And Tonga's volcanic eruption, as dramatic and terrifying as the consequences were, I don't think anyone knows about it or thinks about it. We just think of it as, oh, this is a weird case because it's an island and it's kind of cut off from everything else, and they never built redundancy
Yeah,
because of exactly where they are. It's hard to lay 2-3 wires in that
yeah,
area, right?
yeah.
As your book points out. So that's why I was thinking about, people beginning to think about these backups in some sense.
I mean, rare earths is definitely comparable, but there's a difference. There's one key difference, which is rare earths are a very tangible kind of commodity.
Yeah.
You know if you're running short of it, right? And you know sort of what will suffer as a result of that shortage. The main thing about data and the internet, I think, is that it's so abstract,
Yeah.
is that it's impossible to even conceive of the eventuality where this might get you into trouble.
Yeah.
The one place where I did hear discussions of this is when I went to West Africa. I went to Cote d'Ivoire for the book, where I wanted to go see this big cable called To Africa
Yeah.
land in Abidjan. And To
This is the
Africa,
longest cable in the world,
it is
right?
currently the longest cable in the world.
Yeah.
And it's financed and owned mostly by Meta. They will not say to what tune and what extent of it, but it's well known that that's what it is. Now, it's a very interesting thing that happens in Europe is that when Europe is dealing with some of these big American tech companies, they're in a position to make certain demands. They're in a position to say, for example, look, if you want the data of our citizens, which you are collecting, we demand that you keep the data on European soil. And because there is a certain amount of leverage that these governments are able to exert, American tech companies will come and say, that's fine. We will just build our own data centers and the data will stay here. A country like Cote d'Ivoire doesn't have that kind of leverage. There are three international subsea cables. There were before To Africa got there. There were three international subsea cables landing into Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire. They needed more. The entire continent of Africa is criminally underserved by the internet.
Yeah.
And to not be on the internet in as full a manner as possible is really some kind of like exile from the world economy.
Yeah.
So a country like Cote d'Ivoire has to make a choice. They have to say, well, look, do we antagonize a company like Meta by insisting on similar standards, saying that, for example, Ivorian data has to be remain on Ivorian soil? Or do we think to ourselves, look, I mean, our citizens just need the internet too much. We're not in a
Yeah.
position to make demands. We will accept whatever terms you give us. Even if those terms are ruinous to us in some way, you are profiting off the data of these people. There is security data, healthcare data, I mean, all this stuff that might be stored overseas, and we have no control over it anymore. So there are very difficult choices that lie in front of governments without much leverage. And they are very acutely aware of this, but they are not, unfortunately, in a position to do much about it. And I draw a parallel in the book to how oil exploitation in West Africa occurred, in Nigeria in particular, where at some point these countries had to say, well, look, just come in and pull out the oil and keep most of the profits for yourself and kick back whatever profits you want in terms of bribes and so on. Not much is being used to develop the Nigerian state capacity itself and Nigerian society. And they had to live with this arrangement for a long time before at some point various countries decided to push back against it.
Yeah, I don't like the oil example so much. I'll tell you why. Because data, unlike oil, is, it's a non-rival good. So, every time the Africans' data is used by Meta, it's not like they have less of their data. So it's not literally like someone stole my health records and now I don't have them anymore. I know the broader point you're making is about control over that data and things
It's
like
about
that.
control and about sort of who exploits it. I mean, there is a certain, healthcare. You're right to say that the Ivorian government could decide to sell the healthcare data in its database to a health insurer and make the money off itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, these data sets sort of circulate around the world. Meta could sell it for less. There is a market in which this data is more valuable, less valuable. And so And of course, above all of this comes the fact that Ivorians have their right to privacy, just like anyone else. So for anyone to go out there and sell it at all is not necessarily the best thing in the world. But that kind of control is not available to a lot of these governments and to a lot of
Yeah,
these
but
states.
again, I feel, I mean, I know the broader point you're making, but there are so many African governments I would trust far less than I would trust an American corporate company. There's also that. Like, we got to be careful about the compare. I mean, it's not an apples to apples comparison to compare Meta to like the highest standard of privacy in Western Europe and then compare them to like some of the worst dictators in Africa who are anyway selling out their own people much worse than just data. So I don't know. It doesn't feel like the same thing somehow. It may still compromise their privacy and sovereignty on a different margin on another day, but it doesn't feel. I would trust Meta more than whatever is currently governing Yemen and Syria and things like that.
I'm not necessarily sure I would, but I mean, that's not the point here. The point is that control should reside in the state that where this data was generated. And obviously the aspiration here should be to build privacy regimes and data security regimes in those countries as well. And obviously there's sort of an interest among everyone to work towards that. But that will never start if the data has already left the country and is being monetized by Meta. And as I said, I don't even necessarily think that trusting Meta above the Yemeni government or whatever whoever's ruling Yemen right now is the natural conclusion I would come to, simply because whoever's ruling Yemen right now has no interest in data. You know, that's
They
not
also
like
have no interest in the Yemeni people, right? Like, do you know what I mean?
it's still a regime composed of Yemeni people. So in that sense, I feel like if they want to abuse the data, that is also tragic. But at least it is their own people who are abusing the data. I mean, I feel like I would be more comfortable with that. The one sort of parallel I would draw, it is not the same, but it feels somewhat the same, which is that the argument that the British Museum often makes, which is that look, if we send all these sculptures and so on back to museums in their own country, they'll be destroyed. The conditions are terrible. At least here they are being preserved and people can come and look at it and so on. But I feel like your patrimony in this case is unfortunately also yours to destroy if you are not able to protect it, but at least it is being done by the people who have generated the patrimony in the first place. So maybe there's some kind of poetic appropriateness I see in that, rather than a Western corporation in one case or a museum in the other case deciding that it will, for the benefit of humanity and for your own benefit, take this data, take these cultures, and decide what to do with it.
So, the second kind of sort of threat that you point out, other than just data control, is what is happening and the fears of Taiwan, which is the geopolitical problem, right? There are states that are under greater threat from, certain neighbors or certain adversaries. And Taiwan's like the very obvious case. It's an island. It has an enormous adversary which is constantly, going over the seas and potentially thinking of cutting some of these undersea cables, which would completely threaten, the Taiwanese economy. And Taiwan is not Tonga. It is a very, very industrialized and capable state. It's technologically very advanced. And I'm sure they've built in a lot of resilience and redundancy when it comes to their underwater sea cables. But it's also really hard for them to stop an adversary like China from just cutting them.
Mhm.
So is this sort of like the new standard for warfare? I mean, it's happened before. It's happened during World War II when, German telegraph cables were cut and things like that. But is this the other battleground that you see forming?
I mean, it's one of them. The preferred term apparently is gray zone warfare, which involves sort of ships that aren't really military ships or naval ships. They might be disguised as fishing boats or trawlers or what have you, sort of accidentally cutting these cables while out on the high seas. Of course, it's a deliberate move. And it's not just China that we're talking about. It is, I mean, the other big player in this is Russia. The Baltic states in Europe and the Scandinavian states are concerned about this as well. The fact that Russian fishing boats will come out and cut data cables, power cables, undersea gas pipelines, that kind of thing. And in Taiwan, the fear is, I think, like, as you said, much more clear and present. I mean, there are 15 undersea cables that land in Taiwan. It is an island, so it depends entirely for its connection to the world on these undersea cables. It is a very industrialized nation. It has these massive semiconductor manufacturing companies. It has all sorts of other sort of it's plugged into the world economy much more than Tonga. And so to be severed, for that link to be severed, I think means a lot more for a place like Taiwan. So what does it do? And what does resilience look like in that particular case? I mean, one is to build up, more microwave relay stations, kind of depend more on satellites, try to route cables. Taiwan is in a very odd place in the sense that one part of it is exposed to the Chinese mainland, but the other part of it is actually sort of away from the Chinese mainland, but is in a very geologically active zone as well.
Yeah.
So it has sort of threats on both sides. But when I was visiting Taiwan and talking to people in the ministry there, the one thing that they said that surprised me was, so there's been a convention ever since the first telegraph cable was laid in the mid 19th century. There's been a convention to say we will publish the coordinates of every
Oh,
cable.
yeah. Yeah.
And this act of transparency is a practical one. It is to ensure that ships don't accidentally
Cut a cable. Yeah.
cut these cables. They don't drop an anchor. They don't trawl where cables are. They avoid these zones as much as possible. Now, of course, that has sometimes not paid off. You mentioned how the British cut German cables during the World Wars. That was one example. But it continues until this day. The undersea cables, the fiber optic cables that have been laid over the last quarter century or so are all publicly available. I mean, you can go online and look at the map if you want to.
Yeah.
And I asked the Taiwanese ministry people, I said, like, are you considering now that maybe it is time to revisit this policy of transparency? And they said, yes, we're considering it.
Oh,
And
that
that
means
was,
they're doing it.
well, maybe, but it's also, it's astonishing that, the current sort of tensions of geopolitics are reversing a policy that is a century and a half old. And
Yeah.
that really kind of says a lot about the state of the world as it is today.
But would you be surprised that some countries have already done this? I would not be surprised if China or the United States have laid cables, or the northwestern part of Europe, which is close to Russia, have laid cables and not made it transparent.
It is true that the US and China and maybe probably other countries have laid military cables
Yeah.
whose coordinates are not known. But civilian cables, no.
But isn't the distinction between what is a military cable and civilian cable also becoming narrower and narrower?
In what sense?
Like, we're talking about in the modern warfare world, we're talking about all these large language model companies being contracted by different departments of defense, right?
Sure.
And it's unclear to me if the DoD cables will be used, or if the Meta or Anthropic or OpenAI cables will be used in the future, or how exactly that proceeds, right? So for data centers, there's a much clearer contractual arrangement that the data has to remain in the control of DoD, but I still don't know if the arrangements have been worked out for the undersea cables yet.
Yeah, I mean, it may be too early for that to know exactly how that's playing out. For example, if let's say Anthropic is contracting with the DoD, which it did
Yeah.
for a while, you might not need any undersea cables at all. I mean, it might just be sort of Anthropic servers sitting in
Exactly.
DoDs. So in that case, the cables don't necessarily come into it. But it is true that for a long time, the military used cables that were laid by Subcom. They continue to use cables that were laid by Subcom whose coordinates are not published. When you say the difference is getting narrower, I think the difference is definitely getting narrower in one sense, which is maybe 30 years ago or 25 years ago, a rival country or a malicious actor could think that the most effective damage to be wreaked or wrought upon a country is to cut the cables that are used by its navy, or to eavesdrop upon the cable that are used by
Yeah.
its navy. I think now you could do more damage to an economy by cutting a bunch of cables that carry civilian traffic.
Yeah.
You could tank a stock exchange. You could,
Yeah.
the hospital system could go into chaos. Airports could not work. I mean, so in that sense, I think from a strategic and security point of view, it is true that it suddenly matters much less which kind of cable you cut. And obviously, the civilian cables all have their coordinates that are published, and they're all out
No,
there.
but I mean it even more directly when I say the distance is narrowing. Like, recently some of the Iran drone warfare was trying to attack and I think did hit the Microsoft data center, right? So that's one kind of example. So if they know that these companies have contracted with certain governments, then their data centers and their cables might be the most obvious point, not to tank the stock exchange, but maybe to, shut down military operations, even if it's 7 minutes. But 7 minutes is a long time
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah.
when we're talking about drone military warfare and stuff like that.
I just mean, I don't think we're at a system at a stage yet where somebody could knowingly cut a cable or a set of cables and think that they would hinder military operations.
Fair
That's
enough.
what I mean. Yeah.
Where does India sit in all of this? So, India has been part of the broader undersea cable network since colonial times. So, I think 1870 is when the first sort of undersea cable was specifically laid for India.
Hmm.
And a lot of this was, the British trying to control the colonies. India was one of the largest and richest. So, it's unsurprising. So, India's actually actively participated in this network since the 1870s.
Hmm.
How does it feature now? So I imagine India has its own underwater sea cables. India also has, terrestrial fiber optics and things like that. Its entire digital public infrastructure relies on this material infrastructure. Does India have resilience and redundancies built in? Is it more vulnerable, less vulnerable than other places?
I would say, I mean, probably less. I mean, look, the big countries, especially countries that have land and sea borders, are sort of uniquely resilient in the sense that even if by some freak of nature the undersea cables went down, there's still sort of land based cables that carry a
Yeah,
lot of traffic. I mean,
yeah,
I mean, the bandwidth of those land based cables is much more than you can lay at the bottom of the ocean. So, in that sense, India, like America, like China and Russia and all these other large countries, has a great degree of resilience built in. There are a couple of things that are interesting, I think. One is that, for example, I found it very curious that since the 1870s, all the cables that come to India and leave from India basically do so from two cities. They all come to Bombay from the west and they leave from Chennai in the east. That hasn't changed at all. And I asked somebody at the Tatas, who once were very actively involved in laying cables, whether why that was the case. I mean, why not diversify? Why, if God forbid a tsunami were to strike Bombay or Chennai, and it has in Chennai's case, and it kind of snaps a lot of these cables, why not build some redundancy in? And the answer is, and this says a lot about the industry also, there's just a lot of inertia.
yeah,
You land some cables in Bombay and you set up data centers there, and then it only makes sense to land more cables there so you can hook them up to the data centers and the landing stations and so on and so on. Before you know it, Bombay and Chennai are only two exit and entry ports for a lot of these cables. So he said, I mean, this guy from the Tatas said, I really wish people would think more about where else these cables can land, because I think that's important to build resilience. From the point of view of laying cables, I mean, obviously, a lot of these big telecom companies in India, I'm thinking of Airtel in particular, they are sort of bandwidth purchasers. They help cables land, so they take care of things like permitting and so on. And when they land in Bombay or in Chennai, the Tatas used to, as I said, do a lot of cable laying. I think that the proportion of that as as part of the overall industry, that has come down somewhat since sort of the early 2000s or the mid 2000s. But otherwise, I think, like, countries like India, America, China, and Russia, I think are sort of the most securely cabled countries out there. I mean, I think the fact that you have a land border is a big deal.
yeah. Yeah, and the really vulnerable places will be something like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands if it
Right.
comes to
Right.
securing the Straits of Malacca or something. Like it must be something very very specific, I imagine,
That's right. Yeah.
right? And
That's
you could always have the Indian Navy patrolling, and I mean I'm sure there are many ways to back that up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you can, I mean, these are not heavily populated places, either the Andamans or Lakshadweep. And so there are microwave links and sort of in a
Yeah,
pinch satellite networks that might do the job.
yeah,
It is islands that are uniquely vulnerable. I mean, Singapore, Taiwan,
yeah,
the UK where I live now is still an island, and the British government a couple of years ago, I think, commissioned two naval warships to sort
yeah,
of constantly patrol the island to make sure that its undersea infrastructure is safe, not just cables, but
yeah.
power cables, gas pipelines, oil pipelines, all of that.
It seems quite wise, actually, right?
Right.
Given the world we live in.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think like in the
Like, they
UK,
have enormous security for ports. And so it would just make sense
yeah,
to extend it out further, I imagine,
I think that's right. Yeah.
right? Because the goods trade and the digital services trade is kind of becoming, if not equally important, at least like, converging in
Yeah, yeah,
importance.
yeah, absolutely.
The other piece of yours that I read, which is about, I think I felt like there were similar themes, is the one you wrote about ASML, which is, there's this entire global dependence on semiconductor chips and semiconductor chips being available for cheap as soon as we need it. And during COVID is the first time we really realized that it's all concentrated in terms of production in a couple of places. And the lithography machines that are making these chips, the chip production so cheap possible is actually concentrated in one company, which is ASML.
Yeah.
And I read another book recently on ASML called Focus. So, when I was reading your piece, my original imagination was, oh, we need to have backups for ASML. And once I started looking into it, I was like, this is the most intricate sort of it's intricate, like almost at the level of war planning. Like, you can't move a tiny thing. Like, if they have a tiny supply disruption for a particular kind of
Right.
glass or a particular kind of lens, or one of their suppliers has a disruption of inputs, everything would come to a screeching halt. And I'm not even getting into the human capital
Yeah.
being highly specific problem. So it just seemed like, wow, it's really hard to find ways to back up ASML in some sense. So is this a similar kind of vulnerability, concentration in one company, or that one company being in one country in the world? Like, what is a way to think about this parallelly, or is just a completely different thing?
It's kind of similar. I mean, obviously it is an extreme case in the sense that just one company kind of making the machines that make the chips. That I think is sort of unique. We don't know, I should say, we don't know if there are Chinese companies out there now making lithography machines. We think they are, but we're not
Yeah,
sure. But certainly, possibly not the sort of extremely specific, very small wavelength
yeah,
lithography that ASML makes. So ASML becomes something like of a choke point for the industry at large. And I think again we must kind of think about it as like what happens to these choke points at times such as these, the times that we're living in. One is that it becomes extremely vulnerable to geopolitical pressures. To give you context, when I reported this piece a few years ago, I was just interested in the fact that I wanted to know like what are these machines? I mean, I'm just curious, why are they so hard to make?
yeah,
And so I kind of tried to find that out. But in the course of that, the CEO would kind of tell me a little bit about some of these pressures that he and the company faced. He would sort of tell me about the fact that they were essentially caught in the middle of this big battle over chips between the US and China. And the US was in a position where it could sort of impose blockades of like what kind of chip technology could be sold to China. And ASML had to abide. And ASML, from everything he said, now he didn't say this explicitly, so I should emphasize that he did not say this. But from everything in his demeanor, I sort of sense that he would rather not abide. This is a business. This is a company whose business is selling these machines, and what they want to do is sell the machines to anybody. They don't really care if China is making the kinds of chips that these machines are able to make. It is particularly interesting that this company is Dutch. It's not
yeah.
British. It's not It's not one of America's old allies like the British or Canada or whatever. It is Dutch. And the Dutch are not enthused about the fact that they are under the American thumb in this particular case. And so I got every sense that this guy was grudgingly, telling me about this blockade that the Americans had imposed. So now but the fact that they are able to impose this blockade automatically creates this bifurcation in the industry where the Chinese have to figure out a way in which they have to make these machines themselves. And maybe they aren't able to get to that, sort of hyperfine wavelength model, which means they aren't able to build the really cutting edge chips that the Americans are supplying to the rest of the world, which means that their technology is, necessarily sort of lagging. I mean, this is what the Americans would like to believe. That is what it means. I think there's a juncture that we're in modern history where I think so these sort of technological choke points, we didn't think as much about them 10 or 15 years ago, but I think like we have to think about them acutely and constantly now.
So the other vulnerability, and I mean, this has been going on for a long time, is nuclear energy, right? And as climate change becomes more and more of a problem, civilian nuclear energy is becoming more important. Germany's fired its plants back up, or is rather bringing them back. I think overall it's the better trade off, given just how big the problem is in terms of, both the problems related to meeting the carbon targets, but also the air pollution. And, this is very much a global south problem, right? So, in some sense, it just seems like the better way to do this would be nuclear energy. But you've also written about how fragile that system is when it's not just about like starting up a nuclear energy system, but also shutting one down. So this is your, reportage on Sellafield, which is, I guess, what northwestern tip of the UK.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, what does it take to decommission something like this? Like, I know uranium and nuclear energy is like a weird situation where shutting things down sometimes may be even more dangerous than starting them up. But it still feels like it's a very similar choke point to what you're talking about when you're talking about ASML or when you're talking about underwater sea cables. Like, these are the kinds of choke points we worry about in the modern world.
Well, I mean, first of all, to start, I think the guy you should have on your show next is a professor called M.B. Ramana,
Okay.
who used to be at Princeton, is now in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia. That must be it. And you can have sort of an hour long debate with him about, is it really wise for the global south to go in? Is it really cheaper for them to build nuclear power plants rather than solar and wind? Does that really work out? He has very specific views of this. I will not speak for him, so I'll kind of leave that
Sure.
question aside. But I mean, look, the Sellafield piece that I wrote for The Guardian, which was a few years ago, came to me the way most pieces I write for The Guardian comes to me, which is just that editor will text me one word and I will say yes or no depending on that. So sometimes
What
it's
was the word that was texted to you?
he just said Sellafield, and I said okay, let me look into it, and kind of that's pretty much it. And his question and the question I wanted to answer was like, okay, look, we all know about the debates about nuclear energy, but like actually, what does it take to shut a power plant down?
Yeah.
And Sellafield is Britain's oldest plant. It had a terrible accident like, three-quarters of a century ago. So like parts of it had been shut down then, but now they're basically decommissioning the entire thing. But decommissioning doesn't just mean, pulling the switch and turning off the lights and shutting the doors. It means sort of making sure that spent fuel rods and the water in which the spent fuel rods were contained and the pool in which the water was contained and the land in which the pool was built and the cooling towers and all this other stuff. Like, what do you do with this material? Because radioactivity is, from our point of view, practically forever. And so the expense and the physical engineering challenges and ultimately sort of this challenge of sort of entombing all of this, far below the earth, all of that was what I was kind of really interested in. And it was almost from a physics geeky point of view that I went out there and was like, let me see what this is all about. I went to Sellafield. I also went to a sort of waste storage site that they're building in Finland. They took us down below the earth, and it was like, half a kilometer below the earth. They are building these huge storage tunnels
Yeah.
where they will store nuclear waste and decommission nuclear material at a cost of 5.5 billion euros or something astronomical. And they have to kind of maintain this site for years
Yeah.
because nuclear waste might seep into groundwater, it might seep into nuclear gas might escape through fissures, so you have to make sure that it's airtight, watertight. That maintenance job is also sort of an ongoing process.
Yeah.
So my contribution to this debate, without necessarily taking a side in it or side on it, is that decommissioning nuclear plants and making the material safe is time consuming, hugely expensive, and arduous. And I think when people are planning energy policies, renewable energy policies in particular, that should probably factor into it.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair, right? And I think it's the same for all other kinds of energies. When we think of solar and wind, I think we should also factor in what it costs to make a grid
Yeah,
that can absorb power that is so variable, because that's the main issue with, renewable energies, right?
right.
when it comes to fossil fuels, there's this huge externality, in the air, both pollution and other kinds. And so I feel like every source of energy has some externality effect,
I
and
think
it
definitely.
just sound economics to, actually account for all the externalities before we take a call on
That's
how it
totally right.
works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think like the person to talk to, as I said, is Ramana, who has taken.
I should definitely look up his stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he is great. He is also a big Carnatic music fan, Shruti. You
Oh,
will like
lovely. Yeah, we haven't even talked about Carnatic music. I got to have you back on.
it.
And I heard you talking with Sharan about like other musical things like A.R. Rahman and other things. Like
Yes.
we have not even we've not discussed our big passion yet, but we'll get there. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll just have you back on one day just to
Another
talk
day.
about
Yeah.
music.
Yeah.
There are two other big things that I want to talk about. So one is your book, which I hopefully get to, but more broadly, I feel like you're a good person, and I want to pick on your brain on how you see the current AI wars and sovereignty wars going, right? So this is very much in your wheelhouse in terms of a lot of the other tech and science writing you've done, which is there are these big American firms, they serve the whole world as of right now. They're at the technological frontier, so it doesn't make sense to completely shut them down. In a narrow sense, I feel like right now in the Trump administration versus Anthropic kind of debate, there are a lot of people who are like, hey, Anthropic should be allowed to do whatever they want to do. But on the other hand, you've written also a lot about what happens when there is this kind of concentration, in the hands of a few corporates. And it's not just about data, it's also about frontier technology concentration in some sense, right? And the way I've read how you've written about it is it's almost like the imperial times. It's not exactly colonization, but it's a very high degree of control and people can hold you hostage. So, there's one, China as a country can hold you hostage on rare earths and critical minerals and a bunch of other things. The United States can hold ASML hostage. Now, how do you imagine things playing out when it comes to these very, very large language model companies? And they are very capex heavy already.
Okay. This is. I'm gonna throw my hands up on this one and say I don't know. I actually don't know enough. I haven't. I've been thinking obsessively about this.
Yeah,
I haven't written about it yet, and I don't know if I ever will. But it feels for me like for me personally, the pace of change has been too fast,
yeah,
and the scale of change has been too great that I think I, like a lot of other people I know, am struggling to kind of deal with what the consequences of this are and like what how to think about this. I mean, obviously, everything you said is worrying. I mean, the tech firms that control a lot of other things are also controlling the frontiers of this new technology is automatically worrying. As a writer whose books I know have been used in training data by at least
oh
two
yeah.
language models out there, I know for a fact that worries me. You know,
Are you seriously telling me that if I typed a prompt and said, can you help me write like Samanth, it will help me write like you? Because I will take that trade. You write beautifully.
I don't, but it definitely has data that it has information that belongs in my books. So
Okay.
it has been fed on the facts in my books. And maybe it has also been fed on sort of like, writing style or whatever, although I don't know how these things are combined and assimilated and aggregated and so on inside these black boxes. So obviously, like from that point of view, also, I am not a disinterested observer. That also worries me. I haven't yet figured out whether I should be cosmically worried about AI as a whole. There are people within the AI industry who have, Hinton himself, for example, is worried about runaway AI and AI that we cannot control. I haven't even gotten to the stage of sort of thinking about that and assessing that for myself and figuring out how important it is. So I think my short answer to your question is I just don't know enough yet.
So let me ask the question a different way, because one of your great skills is how to approach a topic when you know nothing about it, right? Like you said, your editor will send you one word, which is ASML question mark or Sellafield question mark, and then you figure out a point of entry. So for those of us who are trying to think about these questions or write about these questions, what would be your advice? Because you also teach writing and you teach journalism, and like what are the points of entry, I guess?
I think a lot of it would have to do, I think the things I've been interested in about this come from a point of view of sort of philosophy and ethics, I think. And the philosophical questions in particular are enormously interesting. I mean, to take the question of writing, like it's a small niche within this bigger machine. But like, what is writing and what is reading? These are very fundamental questions that we had answered for ourselves for a long time. And now we suddenly think that maybe we have to re answer them. Or maybe we don't, and maybe large language models are not writing. So that question has to be resolved, and we have to think about it. The relationship between a piece of writing and its reader also has to be reassessed. There are many sort of blind tests where people are given AI, pieces of writing generated by AI, and they are moved or astonished or
Yeah.
sort of charmed in the way they would be if a human writer had written it. They don't
Yeah.
know that an AI has produced it. But if they are sort of charmed or moved by it, what does that say about writer's relationship to a reader, writing's relationship to its reader? There is a there is in critical sort of lit crit, as it were, there is a school of thought that depends on what is called reader response theory. And reader response theory basically says if I am a writer, I can put all the sort of subliminal messages and themes and hopes and emotions into a piece of text that I want, but the only valid interpretations and responses are the ones that it generates in a reader. That is the only thing that matters. So the reader is
Wow.
creating a piece of text as they are reading it, and that is the piece of text that matters. It is not what you put in there. And so if you were to go by reader response theory, then it should not matter who puts a piece of writing out, whether it's a large language model or a writer, a human writer. Now, that is a very, very alarming thing to think about for somebody like me who has been writing for the better part of a quarter century. I don't know how to feel about that yet. I have no idea.
By the way, I think the critical theory guys need to get their Marxism right here because, on the one hand, they also have labor theory of value and what it means to be a writer and so on. So I think the crit guys need to get in a room and sort this out, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I think like literary criticism. I mean, those guys are not necessarily Marxists. But when you outline reader response theory to me or to somebody else,
Yeah, it
it
is
sounds like
alarming.
a perfectly valid thing to think about. That ultimately the only thing that matters is the relationship between text and reader. I don't know how to feel about that. I have no idea. I have not come to a conclusion about this in any way at all.
Yeah, no, this stuff, and hopefully you'll come back and you will talk to us more and more about this. I want to definitely talk about your book a little bit. The other book, which is A Dominant Character. This is an intellectual biography, I want to say, of JBS Haldane. Like, it's not just a biography, it's not just political, it really makes
Yeah,
him come alive. So
yeah.
first of all, I have a complicated relationship with Haldane because I really like admire him and love him in parts and like really find some of it quite alarming. And I was thinking about what are some of the parallels between the two books. And, I don't think I'm misremembering. There's a lovely bit where you write about Haldane being called by the British government during the war years because they lost a submarine. And
Yeah.
he needs to he's a geneticist and he needs to figure out how to help soldiers and other people in the war effort survive underwater. That portion actually just came alive in my mind because it brought together all the different threads that are in the book, which is, testing on oneself, which is something, Haldane's father did and which also
Yeah.
formed him as a scientist. It's your obsession with underwater, underground stuff, which I don't seem to be able to get away from it. But it's also how science progresses. Like, how do we think about other human beings and testing on them, or is everyone equal when it comes to testing? And like that seemed like a good entry point into the Haldane book when I was trying to connect all the threads.
So Haldane was not a trained scientist. He never got a degree in any science, but he became most well known as a population geneticist, which
Yeah.
basically involves kind of building mathematical models to tell us how genes spread through a population, through time and through area. And so so some of his biggest contributions were in population genetics, but not the only ones. I mean, he wrote papers on the movement of bees. He did a lot of physiological experiments of the kind that involved respiration and the kind that you talked about when he was doing submarine research. So he was just sort of a polymath. He was kind of overall one of the, somebody called him the last man who knew all there was to be known,
Yeah.
which is a reflection partly of the times that he lived in because science had not gotten hyper specialized as it is today, but also partly it reflects his polymathic abilities. And as for his politics, he started off on the left and at some point became a card carrying communist for the better part of, I'd say, 15 years. And then, sort of quit the Communist Party, left England, moved to India, where he was at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, and then he moved to Bhubaneswar and he died there. So, it's he lived a very full life. He was in the trenches during the First World War. He was doing all this research during the Second World War. He went to Spain during the Civil War. He was thought, the MI5 thought he was a Russian spy and spied on him for the better part of 20 years. He was very actively involved in sort of promoting and talking about science. He was a very well-known figure back in his day. And of course, because of his political beliefs, he was even more sort of outspoken and radical at that time. But more than anything else, I was kind of interested in this era in which he was not the only one who was a political figure among the scientists that he was a part of in the UK and in the US. It was quite a common thing at the time for scientists to be outspoken about political issues. And
Yeah.
admittedly, this was a time when, for example, to take genetics, I mean, the study of genetics was being misrepresented and sort of used as an excuse for violence.
And
In
eugenics, I mean, quite explicitly
yeah,
racist and sterilization campaigns being
everywhere in the
recommended and things
US,
like that. Yeah.
in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in the USSR. I mean, there was no sort of country of the Western world where this was not happening. And so at a time in which science was sort of being put to this kind of use, I found it very interesting that scientists of that time would actually sort of stand up and be counted on one side or the other. And I was researching this book starting from sort of 2016, 2017, at a time when it seemed to me that that was not happening enough today. Obviously there's been a long running kind of perversion of climate change data by the right. And there haven't been enough sort of climate change scientists, I think, sort of standing up and saying, look, climate change is a fact, and these are misrepresentations of studies. But then, around the time that Trump took office the first time, there was this big march for science, and it slowly started to seem as if scientists were realizing that their role is not to sit in an ivory tower and do their science, an ivory lab, as the case may be, and do their science, but they have to sort of go out there and engage in the public sphere of ideas
Yeah.
if their work is to matter.
Yeah. And this is not just a right thing, right? I mean, this happens on across the spectrum. Like right now, the medical community is completely under threat from the left, for instance, when it comes to certain medical practices. I mean, the most alarming thing I've read about it recently is chest feeding, right? Where they pump in hormones into someone who is trans and self-identifies as trans and allow them to feed an infant where we don't know the harms that come from, these pumped in hormones and what that's going to do to the infant child. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think of it as a left or a right thing. I think of it as a political capture of any kind of scientific integrity issue.
I just meant that when I was researching the book, the things that were on my mind at the time were
Oh, yeah.
basically these two or three sort of instances that I talked about. And of course, in the book, I talk extensively about how the left in the Soviet Union
Yeah.
was also sort of
Oh my God,
capturing
yeah.
and misrepresenting agricultural science and genetic science.
And Lysenko is like an important person in this, right? Like, and they had a complicated relationship between them.
Yeah. So I think so I was very interested in this kind of intersection of science and politics and sort of what that looks like. And I talked to, the research that I did for the book involved obviously a lot of time in the Haldane archives, but it also just involved talking to a lot of scientists about their views on this. I mean, their views on, and I happen to know a lot of people who are very political people who are also scientists. And they kind of guided me through and explained a little bit of how the nature of scientific work has changed over the last 60 years and why it has made it difficult for scientists to speak up today necessarily and to engage in sort of this public sphere of ideas.
And is it just the funding models which are the problem? Like, so, I mean, you're absolutely right. During the time, of course, you had people like Haldane, but, this was also just after the nuclear bomb came about. So you had everyone from Einstein, like, the top physicists and so on in the United States, having very strong opinions about science and technology being used towards political ends or being used in a war effort and so on. So there were many outspoken critics. And you're right, we don't find too many now. At least no one as large in the popular imagination as Haldane or Einstein or someone like
Yeah.
that. So one is just science has become very concentrated and specialized and sits in these very specific research centers that have very long-term funding models. So that's one possibility why they don't engage as much. What are some of the others?
I think that's right. I mean, funding is one thing. It's not necessarily it's also sort of who you're getting your funding from and whether you want to annoy a funder. It is the hyper specialization of science, which means you have to start thinking sometimes right from your undergraduate years about like what you will pursue in your PhD if you're really passionate about this stuff. Which also, and it also involves the dwindling of an education in the humanities, in literature, and sort of anything that I think might go some way towards creating some sort of empathy for people on a social and personal level. And I think like if you're sort of shut up in a lab from day one of your undergraduate years, which, as scientists have told me, some people are, it becomes much harder to kind of think about the ramifications of your science and your work out there when it goes out into the real world. So it's a number of these things. And I think sort of, academia has made it sort of more and more easy for you to retreat into itself. And I think maybe it's something that is changing now, maybe not in the sciences so much. I'm not sure. This is something I should check out now. But like the number of scientific positions, the number of PhDs who come out of a university and sort of struggle to find academic positions these days is obviously much more in the social sciences and the arts and the humanities. But there's some kind of like effect on the sciences as well. And I'd be curious to see sort of whether the competition for the academic positions that exist, the cutthroatedness and kind of monomaniacal focus that you need to get these positions, does that alienate you even more from the rest of the world, or does it make you sort of rethink the role of academia and your own role in all of this? It's all very interesting. Of course, scientists don't always go into academia. They sometimes go
Yeah.
into industry. And that is its own sort of set of closed doors. You definitely don't want to speak out if you're, sitting in the bowels of a corporation that is doing terrible things to the world. At least university academics, we used to think had some degree of freedom. I don't know if that's the case anymore.
But now when I think about connecting this back to our earlier conversation, I'm very optimistic about AI and the large language models helping in this. So I think one, the barriers of entry for regular folks to enter scientific research has lowered, right? So you see 15-year-old young people, 16-year-old young people like suddenly start decrypting old Indic or Indus Valley scripts, or the Vesuvius scrolls, or they start looking at chemical combinations, or AlphaFold, which is about protein folding. So now it suddenly seems like the barriers to entry for a lot of the sciences get lowered as long as people have access to some of these tools, as opposed to just getting entry into some of the top universities in the world. So in that sense, it might become more democratic, and they'll also be able to pursue other things. They don't have to be monomaniacal the way you pointed out, and they can maybe start differently. But the other part is, I think large language models can also help existing scientists write better. I think we have very poor science writing, or at least very little of the good science writing. So I'm a little bit more optimistic on this going into the future than I am when I look at the past.
No. My natural state of being about any part of the world at this point in time is pessimism. So it has nothing necessarily to do with sort of how much I know about AI and like, what I think LLMs will do for us. But I just feel like based on recent record, let's say, it is safe to assume that if things have a chance of going badly, they will probably go badly.
No, I have a lot of faith in young people and their ability to use technology well.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, and I also have a lot of faith in decentralized systems, which is again a theme that keeps recurring in your book, right? Like, I know that the cables might be concentrated, the data centers might be concentrated, but it also puts this extraordinary tool in every single person's palm in the world very soon. And that there is something to be said for that. At least that's what's causing my optimism.
Okay. I think you're just like a naturally optimistic person, Shruti. And I think like I have been soured by experience in the world. So I don't know whether
This is what happens when you're a journalist.
this is what happens when you're a journalist. It's true. You see the seamy side of society all along and you think like there's no good in people. So if somebody wants to sort of use AI to destroy the world, they will try to use AI to destroy.
No, I'm not saying people won't try to use AI to destroy the world. I'm saying also I see that's not the only side I see, I guess, is where my general optimism
No, that's true.
comes
I mean,
from.
there's definitely like, upsides and downsides to everything. I completely agree there. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you should do an optimistic piece. You should chase some of these
Should I?
12-year-old kids who are using AlphaFold to figure out cures to new diseases. I think it might change
I love
you
the
a
fact that
little
you're
bit.
making it sound like every 12-year-old kid out there is using AlphaFold.
No, not every 12-year-old kid. But, I also run Emergent Ventures, which is this Moonshots grants program that we run at the Makeda Center. I've given about 400 grants across India. And at any given point, 10% of my grants go to people below 18. And they're literally trying to map the known universe. They're trying to understand which star exploded where. They're trying to figure out protein folding. They're trying to solve air pollution. So I actually come across a lot of these people. Maybe we should introduce you to some of them, and you can do some cool stories.
It would be a welcome change from people I meet otherwise in that age bracket who are basically thinking about what to put on TikTok and, sort of who can't read more than a page at a time. I mean, the kind of, feedback I get from people who teach undergraduates in universities about the fact that they can't assign reading anymore because people can't read.
Samanth, you're sounding like those Mylapore uncles. No, we got to get you out of this.
I'm from the Adyar side, first of all. So but like secondarily, I mean, look, I am all said and done, I'm a writer. I have for 35 years, for 35 years, I've kind of been obsessed with reading. And I think it is still an important way, not just to disseminate information, but to start people, to teach people how to think critically.
Yeah. No, of course.
And if people can't do that, then we have a problem. And no amount of alpha folding will help if you can't sit with a piece of text and try to come up with original responses to it.
Fair enough. Before I let you go, first you have to promise you'll come back and talk about music and more about Haldane and other things.
We will have far fewer disagreements on that front.
Well, you never know. No, but before I let you go, what are you working on right now? Because you're always working on like 3 or 4 different interesting questions at any given point. You don't have to tell us the exact story that's commissioned, but whatever you can tell us.
Not much, actually. Well, so, I mean, I'm working for the last year-ish. I've been associated with a new magazine called Equator, of which I'm currently the acting managing editor. We launched in late October, and we publish long-form pieces. We publish essays, memoirs, some fiction and some poetry. It's all online as of now, but we have a print issue coming out later this spring. So I am involved in sort of helping with that. I commission and edit pieces. Yeah. I help fundraise. I do marketing, and I write the newsletter. I help put a podcast together. So there's a lot of this stuff that I do, and that is taking up most of my time. The rest of my time is taken up with the 1-year-old who we have at home.
Yeah.
Whatever little is left, which is not much. I actually haven't managed to do much writing over the last year. That's the truth. And I'm only now slowly getting back into it. I'm working on a review essay for the New Republic about the commercial space industry in the US. I'm working on a photo essay for the New Yorker, a couple of investigative stories for Business Week and The Economist. So just things that are slowly starting to accrete, because now I finally have time to read and think and go out and do interviews and so on. So it's been interesting. I mean, it's the longest I've gone without writing big pieces, I think. And obviously I miss it, so I want to get back to it.
Well, we look forward to reading all of it, and we'll link to all of it in the transcript. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Shruti. It's been such a pleasure.
Ideas of India is produced by the Makeda Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and @Ideas of India. Also, check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.